Welcome to the VAW-VRC Oral History Project, dedicated to sharing great stories from the Navy's Airborne Early Warning community. My name is Lee Armstead, and today is my great pleasure to interview Rear Admiral Hal Bernsen, U.S. Navy retired, the first community officer selected for flag rank. Admiral Bernsen was born and raised in Boston, attended Dartmouth College under the Navy's Holloway Scholarship Program, graduating in 1958. He began his relationship with the early warning community as an E-1B pilot in VAW-12, initially based in Quonset Point, Rhode Island, later flying the E-2A, E-2B, and E-2C aircraft. He commanded two squadrons, VAW-126 and also the RAG, which at that time was called RVAW-20. Subsequently, he served as the CO of the USS LaSalle, the Navy's flagship in the Persian Gulf, and the carrier of the USS Lexington. He was promoted to Rear Admiral in 1984, and his most noteworthy tour as a flag officer was the Commander Middle East Force, which was the forerunner to the Fifth Fleet during the tanker war with Iran in the mid-1980s. He was promoted to 2 stars in 1988. After 33 and a half years of service, he retired in 1991. His remarks today will focus on his early career flying the E-1B. Admiral, could you tell us how you became interested in naval aviation?
Well, I was 8 and 9 years old at the end of World War II, 1944-45. And aviation and airplanes and great pilots were very much a part of that whole thing. And for a kid, it was extremely exciting, and I got very involved in building model airplanes and things like that. But really, it was many years later before I really became interested in naval air. And the clincher was between my sophomore and junior year in college, when we went on a summer cruise, and that cruise was actually on land. We went to Corpus Christi, and we were able to fly in some of the Navy's training aircraft, including the last seaplane we had, the P-5M. And that convinced me that aviation was the place to be. But I recognized that the surface Navy required, and the Navy required us to go into the surface Navy for 3.5 years. It was 5 years for naval air, but it was worth it. When I graduated, that's where I was headed. But the Navy said, well, you've got to spend 3 months on a destroyer first before your opening comes up in Pensacola. 3 months on a World War II destroyer was enough to really convince me that being on an aircraft carrier was a better deal. So off I went to Pensacola and began my flight training. I ended up in the advanced jet syllabus. But when I got to NAS Kingsville, in preparation for flying the F-9F Cougar, which had been the first-line fighter, but was now the advanced jet training aircraft, I found out that the Cougar engine was having significant problems, and it was going to be 3 or 4 months before they were fixed. And as a result, the Navy and my group of 6-7 people, 7 students, were then reassigned to other pipelines, and mine ended up being the S2F, and that's basically what happened. That was the same period of time, late 1959, early 60, when the E-1B, which at that time was known as the WF-2, was being introduced into the fleet in the VAW-11 in San Diego and VAW-12 in Quonset Point. They needed fresh, new blood, new pilots, and so a bunch of us were assigned, and my group went to Quonset Point.
So tell us about Quonset Point, because most of the aviators right now are not really familiar with the VAW operations that were conducted there.
Well, Quonset was, at the time, 1960, was the largest naval facility in New England. It was a pretty good sized air station. It had a naval air rework facility on board. The Seabees were based there. It was home to a multitude of S2 squadrons. The aviation activity was primarily focused on ASW, and we even had a couple of aircraft carriers that were home ported in Quonset Point. And as a matter of fact, there's a photo of a couple of them at the pier. Over time, I think they were all Essex carriers. The Essex, the Wasp, and the Lake Champlain were a couple of the ones that I was familiar with.
So you're now at Quonset Point, you're in your first squadron. Tell us about what your experience is in that first sea tour.
Well, my first squadron was VAW-12. Up until the transition into the E1, it had been flying the AD-5W Guppy. The Guppy was a variant of the A1 Sky Raider, and they hung a radar antenna on the fuselage. It didn't have a fantastic capability, but that was the Navy's Airborne Early Warning capability at the time. There's a photo here showing a whole line of Guppies in front of one of the hangars at Quonset Point. In 1960, as I said, the squadron was pretty rapidly transitioning to the E1. It was designated the WF2, and that's where the nickname Willie Fudd came from. But in my comments today, I'm going to refer to it as the E1B and avoid the confusion. The airplane was built by Grumman. It began its development back in 1955. The first operational aircraft was flown in about 1957, and by the end of '59, it was being introduced. It was an airplane derived from the S-2, so it had a lot of common characteristics. The engines, for example, two Wright R1820 engines, generating about 1,525 horsepower. Max speed of the airplane wasn't very great. It was 227 miles. That dome didn't help the speed very much. Its service ceiling was something over 15,000 feet, and its max range was about 1,000 miles. The APS-82 radar, which was installed in the airplane, was a really dramatic improvement over the Guppy. It had a height finding capability. It had an airborne moving target indicator capability, which suppressed sea state and interfered with getting contact with an incoming aircraft or an airborne aircraft. And its range with that AMTI capability was around 250 to 300 miles. Pretty good radar range. The problem with the airplane was that it was very difficult to maintain the avionics. It was a tube-based system, unlike anything we have today, and tubes didn't react very well from heavy, hard carrier landings and catapult shots. The airplane was manned by two pilots, had two operators in the back, one officer and one tech, and his job was to maintain that tube-based system as best he could. 88 aircraft were produced over the years. It operated really in the active fleet for 10 years, from 1960 to 1970. A few airplanes remained flying after 70 in the reserves until about 77. But by 1970, the airplane had been retired, and that was basically the end of its operational capability and operational period. 56 deployments were made to Vietnam, to the Vietnam area of operations during the life of that airplane, which was quite amazing.
So you talk about you were in VW-112. How is that different from the average squadron?
Well, it was really very different. It was a much, much larger squadron, about 200 officers and 800 enlisted at its height. Its mission was to train, organize, and provide 4 plane detachments to the 10 Atlantic Coast aircraft carriers. It really was a serious management challenge. Now, for a young JO, as I was in those days, I didn't really understand that challenge. All I understood was that there were a whole bunch of people that kept moving in and out of the hangar all the time. Detachments were going, detachments were coming. And it must have been difficult for the leadership in that squadron to cope. And in particular in 1960, because we were transitioning to a new airplane. New junior officers were assigned to a detachment. In my case, it was Det 60, which was the Saratoga detachment. Saratoga being a carrier homeported in Mayport, Florida, a long way to the south. I was also assigned to a division in the squadron for training, and in my case, that was airframes power plants with the same kind of job that I had in the detachment. It was sometimes a little difficult to work for two bosses, but it was still exciting because we were introducing a new airplane. A detachment was composed of about 14 officers and 43 enlisted, was led by a lieutenant commander officer in charge. Most of the senior officers were really senior lieutenants, but they came from other communities, and most of them did not really know very much about the airplane or its capability. My introduction to the E-1B came very quickly after arriving in Quonset in May of 1960. Saratoga was scheduled to deploy in September, so almost from the very beginning, the major focus was on getting the detachment ready to go to sea. Our O&C was an old hand, and he was a good leader. We quickly became a pretty tight-knit group and a motivated group. There were multiple lectures, training flights, division work, and then off to Mayport and Saratoga in August. Not very long. We left for the Mid the following month in September, and we didn't return until February of 1961, 6 months later.
So they always say your first cruise is your best cruise. How was your first deployment?
Well, I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed it tremendously. It was a very different mission and a very different flying experience from what I had initially wanted or expected, but it was still exciting. Carrier ops on the flight deck, the whole business is pretty exciting, regardless of what you're flying. The 60 to 61 deployment was the first for the E-1B on the Saratoga. The ship and the air wing was really not familiar with the aircraft or its capabilities. So we spent an awful lot of time that first cruise persuading our fellow aviators the value of the aircraft and how it would contribute to the mission. During the exercises, we obviously alerted the ship to incoming aircraft, simulating attack. We provided fighter vectors to encounter those airplanes and resist them. We provided lost plane assistance, nighttime assistance. We did a lot of basic communications relay. There were a whole series of missions which were not focused on warfighting but contributed to the overall capability of the carrier and the air wing. We returned to the U.S. in February of 61, Saratoga to Mayport, and the detachment to Norfolk. But by the end of the second deployment, which left in November of 61 to May of 62, just 8 months later, by that time, things had improved significantly, and we were more welcomed on board, and I think people had a much better idea of what we could do to help. So that made the second cruise, I think, even better in many respects than the first cruise. During both cruises, the political situation in the Mediterranean was pretty good. There were no significant wars that were going on. As a result, our schedule was pretty normal and regular. We stuck to the 6 months. We spent about a month and a half in the Western Med early in the cruise, 2 months in the Eastern Med, and then back to the Western Med for another month and a half before we steamed home. The American sailor, by and large, was popular and well received. As a result, I think they enjoyed their deployment as much as the officers did. The big surprise came in early 62. While we were on deployment, VAW-12 was ordered to permanently move from Quonset Point to Norfolk. Well, it made sense. They're going to be closer to the fighters that they worked with at Oceana and other bases, and we were certainly going to be closer to the attack carrier force that we worked with all the time. So after returning from deployment in May, my wife and I relocated to NAS Norfolk in September of 62. I did not make an extended overseas deployment again before my tour in VAW-12 was over, and I reported for shore duty in October of 63.
So besides the cruises, were there any other particular experiences in this first fleet tour that you'd like to tell us about?
Well, there were a whole bunch of experiences, but most of them have sort of faded in time. But let me mention two that are still reasonably fresh and that I remember pretty well. The first occurred in May of '61. After returning from my first med deployment, it was time to fully qualify as an plane commander. And the first step in that process was to be carrier qualified. I joined a group of folks that were going to qualify, and we flew 3 aircraft from Quonset to Oceana. And we were going to operate with the USS Intrepid, which was off the coast of Virginia and engaged in carrier quals. We alternated our day qualifications with some of the squadron folks that were based at Oceana. I teamed with another JO, a guy by the name of Mike Frawley, who was a good friend, and we completed our day quals in about 4 days. We commenced night ops on the night of the 20th of May. It was a dark night, sliver of a moon. It was clear, but and the sea was nominal. I got my 4 traps. I moved to the right seat. Mike moved to the left seat, and he got his quota. On his last cat shot, as we were moving down the catapult, the right engine quit. Well, we had practiced loss of an engine many, many times, but this was real. In the dark, it was adrenaline flowing, panic. Fortunately, we did remember the checklist, and I think Mike did a fantastic job in keeping that airplane in the air. Max left rudder, raised the gear, feathered the right engine. We lost the exterior lights in the process. That was part of what happened. The air boss and the captain of the ship were absolutely convinced that we were in the water. We had dived off the bow. The distance from the flight deck to the water was about 52 feet, and I think we recovered at about 10 feet off the water. With 2 of us on the rudders, we were able to keep the aircraft moving straight ahead. We were struggling to reset everything, and then finally we turned on the lights, and we transmitted on the radio that we were still airborne, and I think everybody on that ship, including the air boss and skipper, were totally surprised. We managed to climb to 500 feet. We pulled back on the engine a little bit because we didn't want the good one to fail. And we drove straight into Oceana, about 35 miles away, and landed straight in on the field. The mechanics never identified the cause of the failure. There were turn-ups, more turn-ups, test flights. We ended up flying back to Quonset with the airplane without a problem. The good news was both Mike and I had qualified day and night.
And you said there was another memorable event during that first fleet tour?
Yes, there was, and this one is really not so much personal as it is a situation that's a national situation, an incredibly important situation, and that refers to the Cuban Missile Crisis. But a little context here. As noted previously, I moved from Quonset to Norfolk in September of '62. I was back on the flight schedule certainly by the 1st of October. And at that time, that period, the USS Enterprise, our first nuclear aircraft carrier, was home ported in Norfolk. She was commissioned in '61, fully operational in early '62, and had returned home from her first 2-month deployment to the Mediterranean on 11 October of '62. 50% of the crew was allowed to go on leave, and 50% of the air wing was allowed to go on leave, and that included the E-1 detachment that was on board. Well, less than a week later, on the 17th, the Enterprise was ordered to go to sea with a full air wing operating and on board. Now, Scuttlebutt had it that this was in response to a bad storm that was forming off the east coast of Florida, and Enterprise was going to go off and escape the storm. Well, that didn't make a lot of sense, but anyway, it didn't really mean anything because we had to form up a debt to go on board. And VAW-12 did that, and I was part of that debt. I packed for a week at sea, one set of khakis, a couple of sets of skivvies, and a flight suit. And we flew aboard on the morning of the 19th as the carrier got underway, after it had gotten underway, to avoid the storm to the south. Well, instead of avoiding the storm, we steamed at flank speed directly south. The next morning on the 1MC, the morning of the 20th, the skipper, Captain Dupois, came up on the 1MC and gave us the real scoop. The emergency departure was not to avoid a storm, but it was to respond to the fact that a U-2 airplane, one of our U-2s, had flown over Cuba on the 14th and had taken photos that reveal large numbers of Soviet intermediate nuclear ballistic missiles in emplacements in Cuba, plus a number of crated IL-28 medium bombers. The CIA estimated that there were about 4,000 Soviet troops in Cuba at that time. Well, interestingly enough, later intelligence revealed that there were actually about 40,000 Soviet troops in Cuba at that time. And there were also 9 additional nuclear-capable short-range missiles, and at least 4 of the intermediate missiles were operational. There's a photo here, a diagram, a chart actually, that shows the continental United States and the range of those missiles. Their capability in toto was about the same as 1,000 Hiroshima bombs. On the 22nd, President Kennedy alerted the nation and announced establishment of a maritime blockade off Cuba. By the time of the announcement, a huge fleet was already moving into position to carry out the blockade. The carriers included the Enterprise, the Independence, the Randolph, the Essex, the Lake Champlain, and there were a whole series of destroyers and cruisers, of course. The Enterprise was in position in the blockade no later than the morning of the 22nd. So we had steamed from Norfolk to Cuba in less than 3 days. The negotiations between the president and the Soviet leader, Khrushchev, had already begun, but at sea we didn't hear very much, of course. But there was lots of flying. We were constantly airborne, assisting blockading forces in the search for the Soviet merchant ships. There was ASW forces searching for Soviet subs, and there were surveillance missions flown by all of the squadrons on board around the circumference of Cuba. The ROE were pretty tight. The rules of engagement were tight. We weren't supposed to fly over Cuba. There was no need to avoid any, there was no need to be a provocation. It was interesting that John McCain, who was assigned to one of those A1 squadrons, actually did fly over Cuba and was severely reprimanded by the skipper of the carrier, as I recall very distinctly. By the 14th, the blockade was in place. The first Soviet ship was turned back on the 15th, and Khrushchev ordered his ships, principally cargo ships, to respect the blockade. Turn around, go home. Serious negotiations continued. On October 28th, Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles and dismantle the missile bases and to remove the IL-28 medium bombers. Most of that was accomplished by early November. And in return, the U.S. pledged not to invade Cuba, and we removed some intermediate missiles from Turkey. There were hardliners on both sides. General Curtis LeMay was the chief of staff of the Air Force at the time, and he suggested that we ought to invade Cuba. And Mr. Castro was adamant that the missiles should not return to the Soviet Union because he figured that was the only deterrent he had to protect him against our invasion. And you recall that in 1961, there had been the Bay of Pigs when Cuba had been invaded unsuccessfully. The blockade officially ended in 20 November. The Enterprise was on station an additional 10 days. We all returned on the 3rd of December to Norfolk. Our 1-week emergency deployment had morphed into 45 days. The United States and the Soviet Union came very close to a nuclear exchange. Retaliation was considered when a U-2 was downed over Cuba on 27 October. That could have led to a nuclear confrontation, but we did not attack. But an incident at sea emphasized the extreme danger of an inadvertent nuclear exchange. A Soviet diesel sub capable of firing a surface nuke was recharging its batteries on the surface at night when it was overflown by one of our P-2 aircraft that dropped 3 flares that had an explosive capability as well, a small explosive, which made a hell of a lot of noise. It convinced the sub-captain that he was under attack, and he began to prepare that nuclear surface missile, and he was going to fire it at one of the U.S. destroyers that was surrounding him. One of the destroyer skippers sent a flashing light to the Soviet that said, it was, "You are not under attack." That was enough to convince the Soviet skipper to stand down and not fire his missile. But clearly it was a very, very close call. A recent book written about the Cuban Missile Crisis based on Russian sources has revealed other facts and some serious incidents heretofore unknown that confirm the seriousness of the crisis. Without doubt, the closest we've been to all-out nuclear war since World War II. It should not be regarded as a relic of the Cold War, but a harbinger of what could happen if the risk of nuclear war is not constantly monitored and mitigated. Well, I continue to be gratified and pretty excited to have participated as part of the Navy's successful response to the Soviet threat. It is a lasting memory.
Admiral, thank you very much. We love your recollection of your first tour in the VAW community. We thank you very much for your time.
You're certainly welcome. My pleasure.
Thank you.